To welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second talk in our Association of Pittsburgh Priests 2021 Fall Speaker Series. My name is Joyce Rothermel, and I will be serving as your MC tonight. Our topic is Peace Begets Peace, and our speaker is Marie Dennis, Senior Advisor to the Secretary General of the Pax Christi International, and dearly remembered past speaker for the Association of Pittsburgh Priests. While not intentionally planned this way, our time tonight, October 7th, 2021, falls on the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and the start of the so-called U.S. War on Terror. Today, some U.S. peacemakers have held commemorations in several U.S. cities with the theme A Day of Atonement, asking our churches to atone for near silence on U.S. wars and to oppose the current drone attacks program called Over the Horizon. Marie Dennis, tonight's speaker, has endorsed this important peace effort. Our program tonight stands in solidarity with them.
Thank you, Barbara. It's so nice to be with all of you again. I enjoyed being with you many years ago and have admired you from a distance then. So thank you for asking. I was asked tonight to speak a bit about the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative and also about the need for an abolition of nuclear weapons. I'm happy to speak about both because, of course, they are intrinsically interconnected. I hope that when we get to time to have some exchange that you will ask me any questions about, most especially about the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. I think you probably are all pretty well familiar with what's been happening, but I can give you an update if I haven't mentioned it or talked about it enough before we break. Many years ago, Jesuit peacemaker Richard McSorley wrote, "The taproot of violence in our society is our intention to use nuclear weapons. Once we have agreed to that, all other evil is minor in comparison. Consent to the presence of nuclear weapons in our world not only accepts the risk of a nuclear conflagration in the future, but also undermines the ethical foundations for the common good here and now. To retain nuclear weapons obviously escalates the possibility of their use, unleashing suffering on an unimaginable scale. Further, the production and testing of nuclear weapons in themselves have enormous environmental and social consequences, including the theft of critically needed resources from urgent needs and the development of a complex and authoritarian national security system to maintain them. I'm sure you all know very well the status quo of nuclear weapons, although they are clearly not a topic of much concern in the United States right now. Perhaps you've already seen a new report from ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which says, and I found this just a sort of interesting and important capsule of what now is the reality of nuclear weapons. It says, as the pandemic spread in 2020 and a global treaty banning nuclear weapons took full effect, 9 nuclear-armed countries spent $72.6 billion on their nuclear weapons, an increase of $1.4 billion over the previous year. The United States spent 3 times more than the next in line, a whopping $37.4 billion. China was the only other country that crossed the $10 billion mark, spending $10.1 billion. Russia spent $8 billion. The UK spent $6.2 billion. France spent $5.7 billion, and on and on. India, Israel, Pakistan also spent over $1 billion on their arsenals, and North Korea, where many, many people are hungry, spent $667 million. The report asks why these countries would spend so much in the midst of the worst global pandemic in a century, And the answer, it is not for security interests or even a resumption of a so-called great power competition, but business that's driving a new nuclear arms race. Pretty breathtaking. After digging through thousands of contracts, annual reports, and lobby disclosures, the report shows that a dozen companies got $27.7 billion in new and modified contracts to work on nuclear weapons. These companies then turned around and spent $117 million lobbying decision makers to spend more money on defense. They also spent $10 million funding most of the major think tanks that do research and write about policy solutions regarding nuclear weapons. Perhaps it's time for us all to look at the Don't Bank on the Bomb campaign, and I can say more about that later if you're not familiar with it. Climate change, thank goodness, is slowly getting the attention it deserves as that existential threat to the survival of life on the planet becomes more and more visible on our screens. But nuclear weapons, the other existential threat to human life and our planet, is barely being noticed. So just maybe a little bit of a capsule about where the Biden administration seems to be going on nuclear weapons. President Biden did extend the New START treaty pretty quickly and is trying to reignite the conversation around the Iran deal. But President Biden has also once again affirmed deterrence as the cornerstone of U.S. national security policy, even as he insists that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter others from attacking. Whether or not the current administration will live up to President Biden's commitment to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in the U.S. national security strategy is still up for grabs. A new nuclear posture review was initiated in early September, so we should see before too long exactly what that looks like. We're hoping that President Biden will at least reaffirm U.S. commitment to Article 6 of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which the NPT review conference, which was supposed to take place last year, has been repeatedly delayed because of COVID, but it is now scheduled to take place in January of 2022. And so it will be important to watch how the US administration engages in that NPT review process. At the same time, there seems to be absolutely no support in the Biden administration for the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, nuclear ban treaty. At least we can't see any indication yet. The next big test for that will be the first meeting of states parties to the TPNW, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which will take place from March 22nd to the March 24th in 2022. It will be very important to see if the United States will even send someone to observe that gathering. There's a lot of effort to try to get the Biden administration to do that. The status of the TPNW right now is that there are 86 signatories and 56 states parties, and the treaty entered into force last year, earlier this year, early in 2021. President Biden actually has the opportunity to reduce the frightening possibility of nuclear war by dropping current ominous plans to modernize and expand the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Also by repudiating any U.S. first use of nuclear weapons, by restricting the authority of the U.S. president alone to launch a nuclear attack, and by taking U.S. nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert, all of which are being advocated by the Back from the Brink campaign, in which Pax Christi USA is very active. It is interesting that since President Biden is Catholic, the influence of the Catholic Church and the position of the Catholic Church based on Pope Francis' teaching could have more of an impact on his approach to this very serious issue. And there are many attempts to get his attention in that regard. Actually, there are two central pillars of US foreign policy that are being deeply challenged by Catholic social teaching as it's being articulated by Pope Francis. The first includes the size of the US military budget, the very narrow understanding of national security as inextricably linked to military might, and the militarization of the US economy, particularly through the massive production and worldwide marketing of weapons, including nuclear weapons. Another deep challenge from Pope Francis that points directly at a second, apparently still unassailable pillar of US foreign policy is his Pope Francis' specific rejection of nuclear deterrence as a morally acceptable justification for the possession of nuclear weapons. For all of us in the Catholic Church who have been working for nuclear abolition, and particularly for an end to the doctrine of deterrence, that strictly conditioned acceptance of deterrence that was part of the challenge of peace and Catholic teaching for so long. For all of us who've been working to change that, this has been a pretty interesting and hopeful period of time. As you know, from the beginning of the nuclear age, the Catholic Church called for nuclear disarmament and decried any act of war aimed indiscriminately against whole populations. But for a long time, the Vatican was very ambivalent about a defensive posture based on nuclear deterrence. In fact, the Church as a whole accepted that as a legitimate stand. In Pacem in Terris in 1963, Pope John the 23rd was quite clear in rejecting military force and the so-called peace methodology of nuclear deterrence. But just a few years later, the Catholic bishops at the Second Vatican Council engaged in an intense debate about war and peace. You know all this, and in particular about the indiscriminate nature of nuclear weapons and the moral legitimacy or not of nuclear deterrence. In its final document, after enormous debate that was encouraged by people like Jim Douglas and Dorothy Day and others, in Gaudium et Spes, the final document, the council clearly and without qualifications again condemned any act of war that was indiscriminately aimed at the destruction of entire cities or extensive areas along with their population, but it stopped short of condemning nuclear deterrence because some regarded nuclear deterrence as the most effective way by which peace of a sort could be maintained between nations at that time. A few years later, during the UN Special Session on Disarmament in 1982, Pope John Paul II encouraged every effort toward disarmament, but reiterated specifically that in the current condition, deterrence based on balance, certainly not as an end in itself, but as a step on the way toward progressive disarmament, may still be judged morally acceptable. That was essentially what was repeated in the challenge of peace after a significant debate here. But in December of 2014, a message from the Holy See to the Vienna Conference on the Humanitarian Consequences of Nuclear War. Remember, there were 3 such conferences within a very short period of time that were pointing to what would the consequences be of even a small exchange of nuclear weapons. And for example, the International Red Cross reiterated over and over again that there was no way that a humanitarian agency like the Red Cross could be of any help in that kind of a catastrophic exchange. So during the Vienna Conference on the Humanitarian Consequences of Nuclear War, the Holy See wrote, "Now is the time to affirm not only the immorality of the use of nuclear weapons, but the immorality of their possession, thereby clearing the road to nuclear abolition." That was a major shift in official Catholic teaching that actually set the stage for the Church's openness and willingness to participate in the negotiation of the ban treaty, of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. To be honest, that statement got barely any notice. I remember at the time we made copies of the statement and delivered them to every Catholic member of the U.S. Congress, just to say, at least read this. It's really important. As a permanent observer state at the UN, the Holy See participated very actively, as you probably know, in the negotiation of the ban treaty and was among 122 states that voted in favor of its adoption. Archbishop Paul Gallagher, the Secretary for Relations with States of the Holy See, signed the TPNW as soon as it opened for signatures on September 20th, 2017, and deposited the Holy See's instrument of ratification on the same day, making the Holy See the first state to ratify the treaty. Then in November of 2017, a few months later, during a private audience with Nobel laureates, including ICANN, and those of us who were participants in a major Vatican conference on nuclear disarmament, Pope Francis definitively condemned the possession of nuclear weapons, saying, quote, "The threat of their use, as well as their very possession, is to be firmly condemned." Since then, the Vatican, particularly the Secretariat of State and the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, have continued to press for nuclear disarmament, encouraging Catholic bishops' conferences to support the Holy See's position, and working with Catholic universities and organizations to reiterate Pope Francis' message, to make it clear what he said. In September of 2019, Cardinal Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, hailed the TPNW as, quote, "an important step toward a nuclear weapons-free world," and encouraged all signatory states to ratify it as soon as possible. Pope Francis reiterated that when he visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the fall of 2019. And during the high-level segment on the UN conference on disarmament this past February, Archbishop Gallagher repeated the Vatican's belief that a world free of nuclear weapons is both possible and necessary. He said that this conviction, reinforced by the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which he said which long ago was considered an impossible dream, but which actually entered into force on January 22nd. He said that it takes a definitive step toward a more nonviolent world and is also embodied in the spirit of the Treaty of the on Non-Proliferation, very specifically refusing the excuse that some nuclear weapon states, including the United States, have used to reject the treaty on the prevention of nuclear weapons. U.S. and other countries have been saying that the ban treaty undercuts the significance and value of the non-proliferation treaty, which is pretty clearly not true, but it's a hard argument. I think what's very interesting about what the Vatican did over the last not very many years, for many, many years, we have been told over and over again, your ideas about disarmament are all well and good, and certainly about nonviolence are all well and good, but we have to live, politicians, religious leaders, bishops have said we have to interact in the world of realpolitik. So we have to present realistic proposals. I think that this process leading up to the ratification and entry into force of the ban treaty, of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, is a phenomenal example of how it is possible to change the context, to change that so-called realpolitik in which we are told we all have to function. And the Catholic Church over these last 8 or 9 years has made a very significant effort to do that without rejecting deterrence and any excuse for the possession of nuclear weapons, the Holy See could not have participated with any real credibility in the ban treaty. And so just taking those steps one after another, some of which you all and many of us have been working for years, was a really interesting exercise. So looking to the future in terms of the Vatican and nuclear disarmament, I have to say that I remain very hopeful. Pope Francis has pretty well solidified a Catholic position against the very possession of nuclear weapons. And I think the Holy See will continue to look for ways to promote the abolition of nuclear weapons as a moral imperative, and will encourage the development of practical measures and a global ethic to make that a realistic possibility. I'm not at all hopeful that the US Bishops' Conference will follow Pope Francis' example. That, I think, is our challenge. On a more comprehensive level as well, our engagement with the Vatican as Pax Christi International and as the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative has convinced me that Pope Francis is moving the institutional Catholic Church toward what I think of as a paradigmatic shift that will ultimately replace the just war tradition that has been at the center of Catholic teaching on violence and war for, 1,500 years, with a global practical ethic built on nonviolence. As you know very well, in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis moved the just war tradition to a back shelf in the Vatican, if you will, literally adding that, quote, with increased globalization, what might appear as an immediate or practical solution for one part of the world initiates a chain of violent and often latent effects that could end up harming the entire planet and opening the way to new and worse wars in the future. During that November 2017 Vatican Conference on Nuclear Disarmament that I mentioned a few moments ago, Bishop McElroy from San Diego said, quote, "The church is in the midst of a fundamental reappraisal of how to balance the Christian obligation to nonviolence with the need to resist evil in the world. The traditional norms of just war, particularly in jus ad bellum, increasingly appear to be incapable of effectively constraining violence in the modern world. The power of nonviolence," he said, "once relegated to the category of romantic idealism, has emerged as a potent force for social transformation and the building of lasting peace." I almost fell off my chair when I heard him say that. We all need to listen with rapt attention to the pleas of Pope Francis, who in Fratelli Tutti also called for, quote, "an alternative way of thinking, a global ethic of solidarity and cooperation in the service of a future shaped by interdependence and shared responsibility in the whole human family." Surely the COVID-19 pandemic is pointing to our deepest calling as a human family to nurture a world of mercy, compassion, justice, and care for one another rooted in the universal ethic of nonviolence. Spending hundreds of billions of dollars annually on weapons and preparations for war, the US House of Representatives is moving forward a proposal to spend $775 billion on the military budget in 2022. That kind of spending has undermined our ability to address the global pandemic that is killing hundreds of thousands of people in our own country and around the world, and has contributed over and over again, this spending has contributed over and over again to our assumption that the only way to address threats, potential conflicts, or even violence is with weapons. In the midst of enormous suffering and upheaval, a universal course correction toward nonviolence as a spirituality, a way of life, a global ethic, and an effective tool for transforming conflict and protecting vulnerable people and communities. Very urgent. For the past several years, the United Nations has been closely examining, as have people in many other parts of the world, exactly what does make for peace. What kind of a world are we yearning for? A high-level independent panel on U.S. peace operations report a few years ago specifically emphasized the importance of a long list of nonviolent approaches to peacemaking, beginning with preventing armed conflict in the first place and addressing the underlying causes of conflict. As a human community, we are just beginning to acknowledge the importance of steps like those in sustaining peace, in building peace in its own right, not only to end wars or past violent conflict. The Sustainable Development Goals, interestingly, articulated after a very, very long debate that sustainable development and peace are intrinsically interconnected. I think we know this instinctively, but we have been very slow to talk about it and to build the possibility of nonviolent approaches into our way of shaping our world. In fact, a very significant increase of attention to the very serious, challenging, and possible work of fostering peaceful communities is growing, is evident worldwide. I've been fascinated by the work of an anthropologist, you might know of him, Doug Fry. Now he's at the University of North Carolina. He's also part of Columbia University's Earth Institute Sustainable Peace Project and has been examining the characteristics of peace systems, of neighboring societies that don't make war on each other or on anyone else for that matter. He, Doug, has identified characteristics such as interdependence, values and norms that highlight non-warring, symbols and ceremonies that reinforce peace, a set of superordinate institutions, skills at conflict management, and visionary leadership as some of the common characteristics among societies that are not making war, are not engaging in violent conflict. Fry's extensive research shows that war is not ancient or inevitable, that peaceful societies do exist. In fact, he reminds us, as we know very well, that most people have to undergo extensive military training to kill another human being. In his book, War, Peace, and Human Nature, Fry underscores the importance of having an alternative vision of a world without war. Exactly. Richly divergent, nonviolent tools and strategies have been the bread and butter for Pax Christi member organizations for decades. That won't surprise you. Trainings in strategic nonviolence for communities negatively affected by extractive projects throughout Latin America. Accompaniment of communities at risk in the Middle East. Sports for peace programs in Haiti and Sudan, South Sudan. Reintegrating former combatants back into their communities in the DR Congo. Nonviolence trainings for youth in Africa's Great Lakes region and for sisters, Catholic sisters as well. Creating creative advocacy to reduce military spending and support diplomatic solutions to seemingly intractable violent conflicts, and on and on. The list is endless. As Barbara mentioned, beginning in 2016, Pax Christi International co-sponsored with the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development and its precursor, the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, 2 conferences where we brought together colleagues from zones of war and violent conflict around the world, specifically to listen to them, to learn from their experiences working with nonviolence in extremely difficult circumstances. And as Barbara also said, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative was formed as a project of Pax Christi International after that first conference in 2016. Also at the time, as you know, I'm sure, we wrote an appeal to the Catholic Church to recommit to the centrality of gospel nonviolence, urging the Catholic Church to integrate gospel nonviolence explicitly into its life, including its sacramental life, and into the work of the Church through all of its institutions. The Church, as you know very well, has diplomatic presence in almost every country in the world and at all of the major multilateral organizations, from the UN to the European Union to the African Union, and so on and so forth. Has a membership of 1.2 or 1.3 billion people, and rich spiritual and theological resources that we believed could make a tremendous contribution to the development and acceptance of nonviolent approaches to a more peaceful world. As Barbara said, we asked Pope Francis to write a World Day of Peace message on nonviolence, and we were thrilled with the 2017 World Day of Peace message on nonviolence, a style of politics for peace. We also asked him to write an encyclical on nonviolence. We're still waiting for that and advocating for it. Building on those conferences, we've published books, we've engaged with universities, we've interacted with religious congregations, we've sponsored 2 annual Catholic Nonviolence Days of Action, and on and on. We've been very active, and with the whole intention of trying to generate deep and wide conversation about what is nonviolence, why is it important, why is it important to include nonviolence in our conversations and not only talk about peace, which is, of course, what we're trying to achieve. We've been trying to have very deep and very wide conversations in the Church to try to get all of us to move past the assumption that nonviolence is passive, that nonviolence is the same as pacifism, that nonviolence is not acting, but rather that nonviolence is a very it's a spirituality, it's a way of life. We believe it could be a very effective global ethic, although there's a lot of work that needs to be done to articulate that. And we know it's a whole spectrum of strategies that can be very effective at controlling violence, at interrupting violence, at preventing violence, starting with diplomacy, unarmed civilian protection, restorative justice, and on and on. You know them. The most recently, we have just published what we are calling a policymaker's tool for effective nonviolent strategies for sustainable peace, in which we explore maybe 8 different examples of ways in which public policy can support nonviolent options for dealing even with very difficult circumstances, all the way from local communities. How are we, what kind of discipline do we support in our public school systems? And then all the way to the engagement of civil society around the world in support for the nuclear ban treaty, and many different examples in between. We're just going to launch that in about 2 weeks with a webinar, which should be pretty interesting. In any case, the obstacles are huge, including, obviously, the very powerful forces behind the big business of making war. But we're pretty encouraged by the progress we've made collectively so far. The difference in the conversation in the Vatican between 2013, 2014, when we first started asking the Vatican to co-sponsor a conference with us, until now, is phenomenal. It's really hopeful. It's very exciting, and I think it will be sustained beyond the papacy of Pope Francis. We really do think that the institutional church, even tragically, with the great loss of credibility that the church is experiencing now, could still have a tremendous impact, making a huge contribution to the kind of paradigm shift we need to make from always dwelling in the context of violence and war, from the local reality to the global reality, to rebuilding, to building another context built on nonviolent approaches. Just about to end there, but let me just finish with a very short reflection from my friends Ken Budigan and John Deere, who remind us of the time in the Gospel of Luke when the disciples James and John asked Jesus if he'd like them to command down fire from heaven to consume a Samaritan village that had not received them very well. Jesus, quote, turned and rebuked them, teaching them and us that violence and destruction are not the way forward. Over 75 years into the nuclear age, we are called, I believe, to pray for the grace of nonviolence, to study nonviolence, to train for nonviolence, to practice nonviolence, to spread the vision and the methods of nonviolence, to foster nonviolent strategies to promote just and sustainable peace, and to end the threat, possession, and potentially catastrophic fire of nuclear weapons by pursuing a spiritually grounded, nonviolent life. Pope Francis said, "A culture of nonviolence is not an unattainable dream, but a path that has produced decisive results. The consistent practice of nonviolence has broken barriers, bound wounds, healed nations. Nowhere is this transformation more desperately needed than in freeing the world from the terrifying threat of nuclear weapons."
Okay, here's a question about what is the title of Doug Fry's book? Marie, do you want to remind us?
War, Peace, and Human Nature, Oxford Press, 2013. He has several books that are very interesting.
Thank you, Marie.
Sure.
Okay, is there anyone that would like to speak for their group?
George, there's a question in the chat. Gregory, how can we find ways of responding to local experiences of violence, for example, of public housing, development of gang culture?
That's a really great question, because we believe in the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative that it's really, really important to recognize that nonviolence has to be contextually appropriate. And it has to be, most often, it will emerge from a local community that, when it begins to look around, discovers or knows very well that people live with nonviolence all the time and can create creative responses even to very violent situations. So I think an important way to start is to listen, is to invite people into conversations about violence. What is violence? I think sometimes we don't really think deeply enough about what is violence. Poverty is violence, environmental destruction of violence, and on, just as much as is direct violence, cultural violence, racism, all forms of violence. So I think that to invite a local community to both recognize the violence in their community, but also to recognize the many different expressions of violence, and then to think about how nonviolence could be already present in their community as they accomplish many of the sort of daily exercises of life, creative ways that people learn how to move through even very violent neighborhoods. The sort of emphasizing the fact that nonviolence is creative, very varied, it is both who we are, how we communicate with each other, how we act. It is also resistance, if that's appropriate. There's a story, a wonderful image, some of you may know it, of a practice in Mali, in West Africa, of a community there that had a practice whenever there was local conflict in the community that was likely to turn violent. They had a person in the community who was charged with jumping into that conflict in in a ridiculous costume, almost as a jester, and acting in ridiculous ways until he got, or she got, the people in conflict to see the humor, to sort of stop the conflict. It was actually a role in society, in some societies in Mali. I just think local communities can be very creative. And I think the one other thing that that I find very encouraging is what we hear from people in local situations that are quite violent in our own country, where there is offered nonviolent training that gives people, young people and older people, tools to deal with conflict themselves before a situation gets out of control. I know this is all made much more difficult with the level of the number of guns in our society, that it really raises the risk and the bar, if you will. But I remember hearing from one young man in Milwaukee say how his life was changed once he realized that he could claim his rights, he could insist that he was heard nonviolently by the way he communicated, that he could de-escalate conflict before it got out of control. And he just said, it changed my life because I didn't have to be violent. And he had been very violent. It's not magic. That's, there's always risk. But I just think starting local, listening to people locally, encouraging people to think creatively is at least a way to start.
Thank you. Michael has a question.
When we with the Stop Banking the Bomb have our demonstrations in downtown Pittsburgh, and when we encounter people and tell them that we're trying to get PNC to disinvest from weapons of mass destruction, namely nuclear weapons, the response we get very often from many people is, but nuclear weapons keep us safe. And this is a response which we get over and over again, that apparently this kind of line of propaganda by the nuclear industry and by the government, etc., has stuck. And it's very hard to get beyond that. Yeah. And it's so different just now to, let's say, in the 70s and 80s, when people really a lot of people had a sense of the danger that we were in with the nuclear weapons, and they were anxious for their abolition. Today, we don't find that in our activism. Yeah. Could you say a word or two about that particular dimension of our?
Yeah, that's very true, Michael. Thank you. I some people say it's not good to scare people, but to tell you the truth, I think a little fear around nuclear weapons is a healthy thing. I think one of the most convincing arguments that I've heard were the arguments around the humanitarian consequences conversation about nuclear weapons, such as a couple of the statistics or the videos that talk about how even in exchange of a few nuclear weapons, how it would exacerbate climate change and produce a situation of famine. Nobody in the world will be safe from that. To think that we're relying on those weapons as security, as you said, is just not true. To me, it really just points to the frustration of this moment in the United States that nobody's paying attention. Thank God you all are, because it's really important. So whatever we can do by way of education is really important, because it's just not getting out there. And we're all doing it on, borrowed money or no money, no staff, all volunteer contributions to whatever time we can give to it, when the producers of nuclear weapons and their friends are some of the best funded industries in the world. And they're making more and more money by doing this. So it's a hard road to climb, which is actually why I emphasized so much the role that I think the Catholic Church is trying to play and could play. To be honest, it is a really hard time in the world. And you've, I'm sure, run into this. For example, when we say, yep, we're the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, the Catholic Church has lost such credibility so tragically. I do think that this, among other efforts, certainly the Laudato Si and the effort around climate change, I think that we have to find ways to move beyond that frustration of that loss of credibility to support what the Vatican is trying to do in dealing with nuclear weapons. It's been pretty staggering to me to see the level of attention that this has gotten, as it should. And the other piece that I didn't mention, but I think it's very increasingly true, is that effort by the Vatican is more and more tied to promoting nonviolence, which I did talk about, but it is also tied to the Laudato Si effort, to the Laudato Si action platform, and so on, because it's all so tied together. It's so integrated. So take every opportunity that you can to tie Laudato Si to the need for nuclear abolition, to tie both to the need for nonviolence, and on and on.
Thank you, Marie. Another person has asked this comment. I like the idea of concentrating on nonviolence while talking about peace or peace building. Could you say more about this?
I can, sure. Many people say to us, nonviolence, can't you just find a different word? I mean, nonviolence, it's just too hard to explain. And so we've thought about it a lot. A lot of people have thought about it a lot. But in reality, the word nonviolence, and I probably am not going to describe this off the top of my head correctly, but as I understand it, there is a way of using language in Sanskrit that emphasizes a point by using the negative, the negation of its opposite. So nonviolence in Sanskrit, which it's a fairly new word to start with, but it makes sense in terms of the fact that nonviolence is both stopping violence and promoting a new way of being. And I think so. we believe that as much as people may object to it, nonviolence is also very clear. In a way, it draws a line in the sand that says, we will not turn to violence, but even as we do that, we will promote alternatives to violence actively. So we're pretty convinced, as for the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, I guess we should be, that help using the word nonviolence, talking about nonviolence, studying nonviolence, taking, a day-long training in nonviolence or in nonviolent communication or in nonviolent bystander intervention and so on, will help us all understand what we're talking about when we say the word peace. We know the word peace has been kidnapped for generations, and we need to reclaim it. So we think it's really important to talk about nonviolence as a way to peace, as a way to to lasting peace. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's pretty elusive, but we think it's really important. And we think the reason that we think there's a yearning for a new paradigm, but that people don't go there because they run into all kinds of obstacles around nonviolence. It's soft, it's confusing, it's impossible, it's a nice idea. We just feel like we need to break through that.
Thank you, Marie. I think it does help us a little bit here. And we have one question that we would like to end with here from Don and Becky Kretschmann. What can we do to bring down the fear level in our society?
I think the best thing we can do is the same thing we do when we look at local communities for trying to engage them around nonviolence. I think the best way is to look around us, because in every direction, no matter how discouraged I get about what the US Congress is doing, or what the nuclear weapons producers are doing, or what the banks are doing, or what is happening in my neighborhood, always, I look at a screen of people like you all, or I look around my own community, or I look at Pax Christi people all over the world. I think that it cuts into the fear, because we're in this together. It's the only way, community, that's the only way we move forward. So the Association of Pittsburgh Priests, Assisi community, Pax Christi, we're always together. And I think that's the only way to break through fear. I don't know what you all think.
Thank you. Barbara, was there something you wanted to get in before we end here? You're muted though.
Okay. Yeah, Marie, I was just wondering if you have any suggestions. One of the barriers we have as far as talking about these things in church is people say it doesn't belong in church, it's political. So it's very difficult then to have programs in parishes and whatever, because, quote, it's political. It doesn't belong.
I hear you, Barbara, and I know that is what is said. But if we're reading the gospel, it seems almost impossible for people to say that with a straight face. I mean, maybe that's another place where talking about nonviolence is helpful, because Jesus was so nonviolent, and he wasn't nonviolent, soft and fuzzy. He was nonviolent, and he was hung on a cross because of it. I just think, I think we need to, but that you all know this very, very well. Lifting up examples of where Jesus nonviolently challenged a deep injustice or a form of violence in his society. The woman caught in adultery. It's a beautiful story. about not Jesus practicing nonviolence in a situation that was potentially very violent. It's too bad when it becomes a matter of partisan politics, but surely it's about how we live together as society. So that's a really hard one, Barbara, because I know none of that will convince, but I think to me, it is another example, though, of why it's so important for the institutional church to make this turn, because we need to have formation at every level: seminaries, Catholic universities, high schools, grade schools, elementary schools, parishes, religious education programs, preschool programs. All of the above need to help us see that the gospel is a story about Jesus as a nonviolent activist in his own society and a lot of other things. So I feel like part of what the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative is trying to do is we looked around to say, well, where can we make a difference with this? And we decided we were going to try to move the institution with all of the structures that exist to understand what a difference it would make if we all knew how to live nonviolence. So yeah, that doesn't answer the immediate need, but maybe in the long run, if we start to have parishes that assume that part of what they have to do is to learn about this because it's part of the gospel. I don't know. Someday.
Marie, we're going to ask you to take just one more minute to wrap things up and give us your last word.
Well, I think that really actually is my last word. Study nonviolence. Nonviolence was not it wasn't my thing 15 years ago. I believed in nonviolence. I was always nonviolent, but I was much more focused on global debt and global economics and poverty and feminism and whatever else. But I am completely convinced that nonviolence is our way to addressing all of those violences that are destroying our societies and our world. And so learn new things about nonviolence, practice saying nonviolence, do a better job than I did of explaining why nonviolence is so important to include in our work for peace. And I think it will make a difference. So thank you for all that you do. You are an amazing group, and I love your book, and I love hearing about your amazing struggle for justice in Pittsburgh and way beyond. So thank you.
We thank you, Marie. Your ministry for peace is an ongoing gift to all of us. Father Bernie Serval, please offer our closing prayer.
You know, a lot of people go to Mass, and very few of them hear the word nonviolence. So our Priest Association has developed a Eucharist of Gospel Nonviolence. Check it out for yourself at the website in the chat. And here's one of the prayers from it. And I pray thus. O Prince of Peace, nonviolent Christ, grant that I may follow you faithfully as a pilgrim of peace in every area of life. Through the reconciling power of your mercy, may our world witness the miracle of your love and peace anew. Amen.
Amen.